and welcome to the Vedanta Society of Greater Houston and our Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna class. Om Sarva Jivana Papanashakaranam Bhaveshwaram Swikritang cha garbhavasa deha pashamidrisham Yapitam swalilaya cha yena divya jivanam Yapitam swalilaya cha yena divya jivanam Tandamami Deva Deva Ramakrishnam Ishwaram Om Shri Vivekanandari Satchishya Supujitaya Shri Sharada Devya Virata Sevitaya Shri Ramakrishna Paramahamsaya Avatara Varishtaya Chate Namaha Om Tabakatamritam Tapta Jivanam Kavibhiriditam Kalmashapaham Shravanamangalam Shrimaratatam Bhuvi grinandi ye bhurida jana. So this morning we are at the beginning of June 8th, 1883. And this is on the top of page 239 in the Standard Gospel. So it was a summer day. The evening service in the Kali temple was over. Sri Ramakrishna stood before the image of the Divine Mother and waved the fan a few minutes. Now remember that Sri Ma, the author of the Gospel, Mahendranath Gupta, that when he gives a description of the scene, that's so that we can visualize it, so that we can enter into it. And you see what a tremendous service that was that M has done for future generations. When you read the New Testament of the Christians, the four Gospels about the life of Jesus, there, the words of Jesus are given, but very little about the circumstances. That he went here, he went there, he spoke to these people, but you don't get a real picture of the surroundings where he is, of the people, of his interactions with the people. It's extremely sketchy, and so you have to imagine all of that. And of course, that is good to imagine that. But here, M has given an elaborate picture of everything within the gospel. And so it's much easier for us to picture these things, plus the fact that the places where Sri Ramakrishna lived are still preserved. His birthplace, Dakshineshwar, Shampukur, where he stayed, and Kashipur, where he spent his last days. All of those, the places are still preserved. And yes, the environs are much different because now they're crowded and the city is growing around everything. But the places themselves are still there. And then we have these descriptions. And so we know, like when it says it's a summer day and it was June 8th, we can be sure that it was very hot and humid. June 8th is before the monsoon rains begin. And so again, we can picture the time, we can picture the place, we can picture the circumstances. And then he tells of the people that were around Sri Ramakrishna on particular days. Not always everyone, because on weekends and holidays, of course, many people came. But he'll tell a few that Rakal was there, Latu was there, etc. So here, again, we get a picture of Sri Ramakrishna, and he's standing before the image of the Divine Mother, waving the fan for a few minutes. That is, the chamara, the yak-tail fan, which is used in worship. And so Sri Ramakrishna, long before this, he had gotten to the point where he could no longer do the rituals for the Divine Mother. He had given up his employment as the priest in the Kali temple. And that is in accord with the scriptures, that time comes when a person's mind goes beyond all rites and rituals, then it's not even possible to perform them. And so for most of us, if we are so fortunate as to come to a point in our spiritual life where we no longer feel inclined to do any ritual because the mind is going higher and the mind just wants to remain and absorbed in the thought of God, then we give up rituals. But in Sri Ramakrishna's case, it happened, as the scriptures indicate, it happened that he couldn't do the rituals. He couldn't pay attention to the time of day. He didn't see the difference between the image of the Divine Mother and his own body. And so sometimes the food that was to be offered to the Divine Mother, he would offer to this because he saw the Divine Mother here. It reminds me of a great Christian saint, Saint Simeon, the New Theologian. He lived, I believe, in Syria, somewhere in that area, but I believe it was modern-day Syria. And he talks about his teacher, who is unknown except through the words of Saint Simeon, the New Theologian, who is himself a great saint. And so Saint Simeon's teacher was obviously a great saint, because he said that, first of all, that he had no shame about his body. He would go about naked. And this, again, was in Syria, not in India, where there had been a tradition of those who were Paramahamsas going about naked. But St. Simeon said that his teacher had no sense of shame about the body. He would go about naked, and he would sometimes point at his foot and see my foot, there shines the light of God. That is, he saw the light of God in everything, including inside and outside. And so Sri Ramakrishna had become like that, and so he couldn't perform the worship anymore because he no longer saw distinctions of time, place, and circumstance when his mind was in a high state. But here you see that still sometimes, even in this high state in which he always lived, he sometimes offered service to the image of the Divine Mother. And I myself have seen some swamis, great swamis, who had nothing to do with ritual whatsoever. They didn't want anything to do, and that was an expression of their spiritual attitude. But there are others who were also great men of realization, who still would go and pick flowers and take them to the temple for offering and so forth, who still loved to do things like that. And so we find that Sri Ramakrishna, after he came back from 6 months in Nirvikalpa Samadhi, he reestablished that loving relationship with the Divine Mother. So then the text continues. Ram, Kedar Chatterjee, and Tarak arrived from Calcutta with flowers and sweets. Kedar was about 50 years old. At first, he had frequented the Brahma Samaj and joined other religious sects in his search for God. But later on, he had accepted the Master as his spiritual guide. He was an accountant in a government office and lived in a suburb of Calcutta. So Ram, of course, means Ramchandra Datta, the uncle of Swami Vivekananda, of the future Vivekananda, and one of the very close and dear devotees of Sri Ramakrishna, and the first person to write a biography of Sri Ramakrishna. And then he mentions Kedar Chatterjee, about whom we'll hear more in a moment. And Tarak, of course, is the later Swami Shivananda, Mahapurush Maharaj, who at this point was 24 years old. So they arrived from Calcutta bringing sweets and flowers to offer to Sri Ramakrishna. recognizing him as their chosen ideal, their guru, and a manifestation of the Divine Mother. And so as they would take offerings to a temple, they took it to this holy man who represented all of that, their own highest ideal. Continuing, Tarak was a young man of 24 years old. His wife had died shortly after their marriage. He hailed from the village of Barasat, not far from Calcutta. His father, a highly spiritual soul, had visited Sri Ramakrishna many times. Tarak often went to Ram's house and used to go to Dakshineshwar in the company of Ram and Nitya Gopal. He worked in a business firm, but his attitude toward the world was one of utter indifference. And so Tarak, the future Swami Shivananda, he lived longer than most of the direct disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, even though he was older than most of the direct disciples, except, of course, Swami Advaitananda, who was already in upper middle age when he came to Sri Ramakrishna. But among the young men, Tarak was probably the oldest of them, and so all of them used to call him Tarak Da. Da meaning Dada, meaning older brother. So elder brother Tarak. But he lived longer than most of them because he was very careful in his later years with his diet. Though in his early life, like the others, he had practiced many austerities, he became careful about his diet and probably for genetic factors also. So his father, Tarak's father, as is mentioned in what I just read, he was a great tantric sadhaka. And so he used to visit Sri Ramakrishna. He was known to Sri Ramakrishna. And it was with his blessings that Tarak used to go to Sri Ramakrishna. As those of you who have studied Sri Ramakrishna's life will remember that many of the young disciples, their parents were highly opposed to their going to Sri Ramakrishna. They didn't want them to spend time with him. But Tarak had a father who understood his spiritual longings and encouraged his spiritual longings. And told his son, Tarak, that I have tried to realize God in my life. I haven't yet gotten there, but may you be blessed with the realization of God. So his father blessed him, and as he sent him out on his spiritual quest. So Sri Krishna says in the Gita, as we saw in, I think it's the 6th chapter. Now, chapters are blending together, but I think it's the 6th chapter. Yes, it is the 6th. After Arjuna asks about what happens when one doesn't succeed at the spiritual path. They've left the worldly enjoyment and sought for God, but they don't get that either. Then what happens to them? They neither have this nor do they have that. And so Sri Krishna says that the doer of good never comes to a bad end. That if a person has dedicated themselves to the spiritual search and they don't find that in this life, that is, it's not fulfilled in this life, then they will come back in propitious circumstances. Perhaps they will be born in a wealthy family where they have no physical needs and so forth. Or even better, Sri Krishna says, even better, they may be born in the house of yogis. Where from childhood they will have spiritual influences. And so that was the case with Tarak, the future Swami Shivananda. He was born in a family of yogis with his father giving him blessings on the spiritual path, which again is rare, because even religious parents hate to see their children go on the spiritual path and leave the world. Because they're not going to have grandsons or granddaughters, they're not going to have family reunions, they're not going to have them around in their old age. And so naturally there's a resistance to seeing, especially in traditional India with the joint family and everything, and with well spelled out responsibilities for children and for parents. The parents would be very reluctant to see their children go in a spiritual direction, even if they themselves were religious. So it's very rare to find parents who actually bless their children and send them on the spiritual path with full freedom, not with trying to hold them back with the ties of the bonds of affection. So Tarak was like that. So It says that Tarak had married. Had been married. It wasn't that, of course, this was traditional India. He didn't go out looking for a wife. His parents found a wife for him and made him marry. But his wife died shortly after marriage. And so Tarak had a job because he was already 24 years old. But as it says here in the text, he was completely indifferent to the world and to everything about the world. So we can imagine that he would go fulfill his duties just as duties, but otherwise completely indifferent to everything. As Sri Ramakrishna came out of the temple, again, he'd been fanning the deity. As Sri Ramakrishna came out of the temple, he saw Ram, Kedar, Tarak, and other devotees standing outside. He showed his affection for Tarak by touching his chin. He was very happy to see him. So again, among all of them, he touches Tarak's chin. That's a gesture of affection in India. I don't know if it's all over India. Certainly in Bengal, which I know best because I spent most of my time in India there. But that touching of the chin, it's not like here in America, where if you see somebody that you are very close to and you feel great affection for, that you reach out and hug them. If it's a man hugging a man, you give him a bear hug, and if it's a man seeing a woman after a long time, that no romantic thing involved, just a light hug. But that practice is not there in India. The way of showing affection in India is not physical, but that gesture is often given. And it's also, you read in Holy Mother's life, where it says that Holy Mother kissed her disciple. And then it's explained, because it doesn't mean kissing with her lips on the disciple's face or something like that. It means that she touched the disciple's chin, under the chin like that, and then like so. So that is the show of affection, rather than getting any more physical than that. It used to be, even when I was living in India in my early years, in the 1970s, early 80s, that you never ever saw men and women, husband and wife, what to speak of unmarried girls and boys, teenagers or young college students. You never saw them holding hands, because again, the culture was that sort of physicality was discouraged. So I'm not saying that that's what Americans should imitate or anything, just explaining the culture, that sort of thing was, it just wasn't done. Even husbands and wives didn't touch each other in public. I remember after I'd lived in India for 7 years, and then came back here, and then went back. No, it was in the end of 1981, before I left India. For the first time ever during my 7 years in India, I was at Bellarmat, where I had come down from the Himalayas to take leave of the seniors at Bellarmat before returning to the West at the end of 1981. And I saw a young college-age boy and girl holding hands, walking hand in hand, which was such a shock. Here it wouldn't have been a shock, but there it was such a shock because you never saw that. And now it has become very westernized in more recent years in India. But anyway, that was, again, the gesture of showing affection. And that was a gesture of showing great affection. He didn't do that to the others who were present there, whom he loved also, but it was Tarak that he touched that way. So that was a show of great affection. Returning to his room, the master sat on the floor in an ecstatic mood with his legs stretched before him. Ram and Kedar decorated his feet with flowers and garlands. The master was in samadhi. So again, they had brought flowers and sweets to offer to the master. And so when they saw the master seated in his room with his legs stretched out, then they offered the flowers at his feet. Kedar believed in certain queer practices of a religious sect to which he had once belonged. He held the master's big toe in his hand, believing that in this way, the master's spiritual power would be transmitted to him. As Sri Ramakrishna regained partial consciousness, he said, "Mother, what can he do by holding my toe?" Keter sat humbly with folded hands. Still in an ecstatic mood, the master said to Keter, "Your mind is still attracted by woman and gold. What is the use of saying you don't care for it? Go forward. Beyond the forest of sandalwood, there are many more things, mines of silver, gold, diamonds, and other precious stones. Having a glimpse of spirituality, don't think you have attained everything." Unquote. The master was again in an ecstatic mood. He said to the Divine Mother, "Mother, take him away." At these words, Keter's throat dried up. In a frightened tone, he said to Ram, "What is the master saying?" So here, first of all, Keter, he doesn't say to what sect Keter belonged, but there's so many sects in India, and there were probably even more at this time in India. So many sects, and so he had belonged to some strange sects, and as a part of his what he had learned from one of the sects, he grabbed Sri Ramakrishna's big toe and held on to it, thinking that thereby spiritual power would come into him from Sri Ramakrishna. And of course, in India in general, it's believed that for a great soul, that spirituality can be transmitted through the foot. Now, what is the scientific explanation for that? I don't have any scientific explanation for it. But you see that it was a fact that in Sri Ramakrishna's life, he often would touch a devotee with his foot. If he were standing in an ecstasy, or even if he were sitting, sometimes he would put his foot out and touch the devotee with his foot. That's never done in traditional India. You never touch somebody with your foot. If you accidentally brush against somebody with your foot when you're trying to get in India, of course, it's a crowded country, a huge population, and people are used to being crowded together. And so sometimes you're trying to get into a crowded place to sit on the ground with other people in a room without furniture, and working your way through a crowded situation, you can't help sometimes but to touch somebody with your foot. So traditionally, you touch the person and salute them to show that I didn't mean to disrespect you by touching you with my foot. So that's a great insult to touch somebody with your foot in India. But for Sri Ramakrishna, he would purposefully put his foot on someone and thereby transmit spiritual power. He could do it with a touch of his hand. He could do it by a look. He could do it by a wish. He could do it even separated by long distance in space. But sometimes he would do it by touching with his foot. So don't ask me to explain that. It's just a fact that we see in the life of Sri Ramakrishna. So he... Keter held on to Sri Ramakrishna's toe, but then Sri Ramakrishna, in ecstasy, he says, addressing the Divine Mother, "What will he gain by holding to my toe like that?" And so then, though it doesn't say it, it says Keter sat with folded hands. That is, when it says folded hands, it doesn't mean like that. Of course, it means like this in Indian context. And so he obviously, when Sri Ramakrishna said that, he let go of his toe and remained like this. So then Sri Ramakrishna, we have to remember that in this state, it wasn't that he was being impolite or being indirect or trying to say something to the Divine Mother about Keter so that Keter would hear it but did not feel insulted that he was talking to him directly saying, "Don't do that." No, none of that. And when he was in a state like this, everything else looked like a shadow. Everything else looked like just everything made of the Divine Mother and just forms sort of floating in this luminous reality which he would perceive. And so the Divine Mother was real, everything else looked like shadows. And so he's addressing the Divine Mother, what will he gain by holding my toe like that? Addressing her. And so then his mind comes down a little bit, so he addresses Keter. And he says, "You are still attracted to woman and gold, that is, to sex and greed. So what good will it do to pretend otherwise?" That is, telling him not to be hypocritical. But he also tells him, don't pretend that you are beyond these things. It's something that you're dealing with. But realize that there are much greater things and go for those greater things. So that also, though we don't know exactly what Sri Ramakrishna saw, what within Keter he was addressing, but what we can learn from that is that spirituality should not be on the outside or in proclamations. It's what we are inside. As Sister Nivedita writes, if we spent as much time trying to become that which we try to make others believe we are, then we would progress much faster in life. And so spirituality is never about showing other people our spirituality. That should always be held inside. Otherwise we easily become hypocritical. So then he says something very terrible, and that also I have no explanation for. No one could explain this unless they, except for Sri Ramakrishna himself or the Divine Mother. He again goes into ecstatic mood after addressing Keter and telling him that you're attached to woman and gold, so don't pretend to be otherwise. But then he goes back into a spiritual mood and he says, Mother, take him away. So he's just been talking to Keter. So obviously, and M also takes him to mean obviously Keter. He addresses the Divine Mother, Mother, take him away. And Keter himself is terrified and asks Ram, what is he saying? What is he saying? Hearing the words, understanding the words, but what is he saying means how could he say that? What does he mean? Mother, take him away. What will happen to me? So obviously frightened by the words of Sri Ramakrishna, because the words of Sri Ramakrishna had tremendous power, and they knew that his words had power and knew that his wishes came true. There was the case of Hajra. So once late in Sri Ramakrishna's life, when Hajra had been especially bothersome, Hajra always tended to be bothersome, but he'd been especially troublesome to Sri Ramakrishna, and he was a terrible hypocrite as well. Sri Ramakrishna prayed to the Divine Mother, Mother, if Hajra is a hypocrite, take him away from here. So 2 or 3 days later, Hajra came before Sri Ramakrishna and proudly said, Sir, I am still here. Meaning the Divine Mother hasn't taken me away. But shortly after that statement, then circumstances took place so that Hajra had to leave and went back to his village home far from Calcutta. So here he's telling the Divine Mother, Mother, take him away. So we can only sympathize deeply with Keter and wonder at what Sri Ramakrishna saw and why he said that. But one thing that I will say, which is not provable in any way, but which is simply a matter of faith. Faith is something that all of us have and use all of the time. It's just where we place our faith that's the question. Everyone has faith, has the power of faith. It's just where we place it and where we are unwilling or unable to place it. But my faith is that Sri Ramakrishna didn't say anything to anyone which was not true and which was not beneficial for the person. And so it might have been very hurtful to Keter, but I'm convinced that for whatever reason, there was a necessity for Keter to hear that, or that some higher purpose of the Divine Mother was there for which Sri Ramakrishna spoke what he did. Because nothing came out of Sri Ramakrishna's mouth except for the words of the Divine Mother herself. And so there was some deep unseen reason, unseen to us and obviously unseen to Keter, or at least we suppose it's unseen to him. Maybe he knew more than what he's saying, that Sri Ramakrishna said, Mother, take him away. But whatever the reason and whatever the outcome of it, we can easily identify with Keter what a terrifying statement that would have been coming from Sri Ramakrishna. So at the sight of Rakal, at the sight of Rakal, Sri Ramakrishna was again overpowered with the spiritual mood. He said to his beloved disciple, "I have been here many days. When did you come?" So M then asks, was the master hinting that he was an incarnation of God, and Rakal, his divine companion, a member of his inner circle of devotees? So now that conclusion is not obvious from the words of Sri Ramakrishna, but that's the sense that M got from these words of Sri Ramakrishna, strange words, because Sri Ramakrishna says, I've been here for many days. Oh, yes, well, Rakal used to spend a lot of his time at Dakshineshwar. And so maybe there had been many days since Rakal had been with him. But why he said, I have been here for many days, and where have you been, or when did you come? So M understood from that Sri Ramakrishna was saying, I have been here for many days, meaning I've been waiting for you, because you are one of my inner circle, whom I have incarnated in order to train, to bring good to the world. So anyway, it's not an obvious conclusion from the words at all, but that's what M understood. And that we can understand. Again, if we just apply analytical reason to this, then the statement makes no sense. We think, well, M is reading too much into that. But we all know of circumstances that we have been in where someone says something, and if you just transcribe the words, you understand one thing from the words, but because of the circumstance and because of the person and because of the way they said it, and the intent with which they said it, the intent comes across as different from just the plain words themselves. The words themselves may not show the intent behind the words. But M must have sensed something from the way Sri Ramakrishna said it to Rakal, that this was his inner meaning. So now we come to another day. So this was on a Friday, June 8th. Now we come to Sunday, June 10th, 1883. The master was sitting in his room with Rakal, M, Latu, Kishori, Ramlal, Hazra, and other devotees. It was about 10 o'clock in the morning. Describing his early life, Sri Ramakrishna said, well, let me stop just for a minute, just not to beat a dead horse, as we say, but just to make the point again, that here M even tells the time of day, as he most often does in the gospel. He says it's 10 o'clock. Now, how many times in the gospel, in the New Testament and the Gospels, Christian Gospels, have you heard whether it's even morning or afternoon or evening? Even that much is not usually told. Now, I'm not disparaging the Bible. I'm saying how lucky we are that we have so much material that helps us to visualize the scene so that we can put ourselves in it. So again, it's not that the Bible is no good. It's that most scriptures, the same with the Buddha and with others, you don't get this picture of the time and the space, the circumstances, the people that were there, etc. And so we're extremely fortunate in having a text like this where we can picture with some detail the happenings. So it was 10 o'clock in the morning. Describing his early life, Sri Ramakrishna said to them, during my younger days, the men and women of Kamarpukur were equally fond of me. They loved to hear me sing. I could imitate other people's gestures and conversation, and I used to entertain them that way. The women would put aside things for me to eat. No one distrusted me. Everybody took me in as one of the family. And so, yes, Sri Ramakrishna was a very good mimic. all of his life. In later life, he would oftentimes entertain his disciples, mimicking different people or different types of people, sometimes not an individual, but a type of person, a haughty babu or a coquettish woman, etc. He had the ability, like a good actor. Sri Ramakrishna was a master actor, where he could identify with the mood and put that in, and his very body would express the mood. So he was an extraordinary actor, that which the best actors strive to do. That was quite natural to Sri Ramakrishna because of the freedom of his mind, where he could dissociate himself from his normal identity and identify with another mood completely. Because of his yogic power, the attainment of the complete freedom of mind, where he could put his mind on anything, in anything, identify it with anything, and then express it to the highest extent. And so he became a great, or he didn't become. He was naturally a great mimic. And as he said, the women and the men of Kamarpukur loved him equally. The boys and girls, the men and women, they all loved him. And so it was similar to Krishna in Vrindavan. The love of the gopis and gopas had for Sri Krishna, that when Sri Ramakrishna was in Kamarpukur in his youth as a child, that was a similar circumstance where everyone had great love for him. Everyone tried to get him to come to their houses. But, he says, I was like a happy pigeon. I used to frequent only happy families. I would run away from a place where I saw misery and suffering. And so at this time, of course, he had not fully developed his great compassion for those who were suffering, but this also is significant, that he didn't, that his mind was so bright, his mind was so pure, that it gravitated towards brightness and away from darkness. And so he would avoid the places where people were very sad. Later in his life, of course, as a great soul, he identified with everyone and could console very effectively those who were sad and downtrodden. But in his youth, because of the sattvic nature of his mind, he was, as he said, like a happy pigeon, jumping from place to place and spending time with wherever there was joy, he would join in. One or two young boys of the village were my close friends. I was very intimate with some of them, but now they are totally immersed in worldliness. A few of them visit me here now and then and say, "Goodness, he seems to be just the same as he was in the village school." While I was at school, arithmetic would throw me into confusion, but I could paint very well and could also model small images of the deities. And so, yes, he had friends in the village. He would watch the village plays, the jatras as they're called. And he had such a power of memory that watching a play, an enactment of a scene from the Puranas or the Itihasas, he could, watching it once, he could reproduce the whole thing from his memory. And so he would teach his friends, the boys in the village, teach them the different parts and the dialogue, and they would reenact the plays which he had seen only once. And so, among the village boys, he had various friends, and as he says here, some of them used to visit him. We know that one of him, who was his closest friend in the village among his peers, was Gaya Vishnu, was his name, a young boy. And later in life, Gaya Vishnu came to visit him once at Dakshineshwar. And this boy whom Sri Ramakrishna had loved so much, they went everywhere together, they did everything together. He saw that Gaya Vishnu had become just a very ordinary, plain, worldly villager. Not excessively worldly, not debauched or anything like that, but just an ordinary villager who was only interested in feeding his family and acquiring land and whatever his ambitions might have been. And so you see the divergence of their ways of life, that in childhood, a person's samskaras have not yet manifested. Some have, of course. That's why sometimes you see, I was reading the other day about a great jazz, what was her last name? Was King, I think? Billy King, was it? No, I can't remember. It was a black jazz pianist who was an extraordinary talent. From the time she was 3, she could pick out tunes on the piano. And then she went to Juilliard when she was 8 years old. She went to Juilliard's, the finest musical school in America. She wasn't allowed in at 8 because she was too young, but one of the main piano professors took her as his special student. So she was trained. So all of that's to say that you see cases like that, or like Mozart, people who from a very early age, they have certain talents which manifest at an early age. But for most of us, and for all of us, most of our samskaras have not surfaced, and for most of us, it's difficult to tell which way we will go in adult life. So it's only when you see these child prodigies that have come into life with a strong tendency and drive to go in a certain direction that you see early in their life where they're going. But with most of us, well, we don't know. It was always a surprise for me when I left home to become a monk. And then after 12 years, I went back, as is traditional, or traditionally allowed anyway, went back to see my family. And to find out that people that I had known as my peers, who seemed to be going in one direction, that it seemed to, from in their childhood, they were interested in certain things. By the time they were in college, they went in a completely different direction. And so I hadn't seen the stages of their development, and especially that time in life when they begin, their own samskaras begin to surface. And so it's only with the approach of the late teens and early 20s that our own samskaras begin to manifest. And that's partly why young people tend to rebel against their parents, because their parents have brought them up in a certain way with certain expectations and things. And then the child, when they're in their teens and early 20s, they're beginning to feel their own samskaras awaken and push them in a direction from past lives. And so they push against the direction their parents are pushing them in and try to go in a direction that their own samskaras are pushing them in. So Sri Ramakrishna says here about these boys that as children, they were all very innocent, and Sri Ramakrishna saw them all as equals. But by the time that Sri Ramakrishna had attained to the realization of God, and he met these old friends, he saw that, oh no, they've gone in a completely different direction. So he says, I'd love to visit the free eating places maintained for holy men and the poor, and would watch them for hours. So these eating halls that are established in villages, they used to be more prevalent. You still find them in holy places, but they used to be in villages all over India. A place where wandering sadhus and pilgrims on their way to because everything was by walking in those days, on their way to a place of pilgrimage, places in the villages where sadhus and pilgrims could stop and receive food. So that allowed people to travel all over India on foot. So how did Sri Ramakrishna's father, Kshudiram, how did he go from Kamarpukur in the northwestern part of Bengal, travel all the way to Rameshwaram in South India on foot? No trains, no cars, no taxis, no buses. He walked all the way to Rameshwaram and back, stopping along the way at different places of pilgrimage, a trip that took over a year. And so how did he do that? He didn't know the local language or anything. He just knew Bengali and Hindi, because he lived in a part of Bengal that was near Hindi-speaking areas. He knew Sanskrit, Bengali, and Hindi. And so in Sanskrit, in those days, he could still find pundits that he could converse with in Sanskrit. But again, he didn't have money. He didn't have a bank account. He didn't have a credit card. He didn't have a debit card. He didn't have traveler's checks. Nothing of that. How did he spend over a year wandering from home, not as a monk going begging door to door? How did he survive? It was because there were these feeding places for pilgrims and for sadhus. So Sri Ramakrishna, when he was a boy living in Kamarpukur, he used to love to go there, and he says that he would spend hours watching the sadhus. I love to hear the reading of sacred books, such as the Ramayana and Bhagavata. If the readers had any affectations, I could easily imitate them and would entertain others with my mimicry. So, as you find in any culture anywhere in the world, people who get an audience, they often take on affectations, where they begin to think that they're big people. And so they begin to act like big people once they have an audience, and their affectations come out. And so at that time, one of them was before a person, a pundit would begin to speak on the scriptures or something, they would take a pinch of snuff. And so Sri Ramakrishna would imitate that, and then other affectations that they would have. I understood the behavior of women very well and imitated their words and intonations. I could easily recognize immoral women. Immoral widows part their hair in the middle and perform their toilet with great care. They have very little modesty. The way they sit is so different. But let's not talk of worldly things anymore. So yes, Sri Ramakrishna was a master at, again, assuming a female role. It's often misunderstood that Sri Ramakrishna was somewhat womanish in his behavior. No, he was quite masculine in his behavior, but not in a virile sense, not in a macho sense. He had none of that, none of the macho, none of the virile manly sense, or the puffing out the chest and flexing the muscles, none of that. But he had a very refined sense of masculinity, but he was not limited to that. He could assume the nature of a woman, so much so that people would wonder and in fact, at times, as you know, he would be in the attitude of a woman friend of the Divine Mother. And he would dress as a woman, and even those who were very close to him, like Mathur Babu, couldn't recognize who it was. They would wonder who this new woman is I've never seen before. So again, Sri Ramakrishna had this amazing ability to put himself into, to identify with the mood. And so he could identify with the mood of women, and women from the time he was a child through his old age. Of course, old age, he didn't live that long. He lived to be 50 and a half, but that being for him his old age. From his youth till the end of his life, women felt extremely free with him. They never felt shyness with him, and they would say that they felt that he was one of them. And so sometimes he would mimic women as he would mimic men also, make fun of their affectations. At other times he would mimic men the same way. But he had the ability to put himself in the female frame of mind and way of expressing, even physically expressing himself physically that way. And he also, as this paragraph shows, he had that ability to see hypocrisy, and he could see also the moral character of a person. So he continues, or the narration continues. The master asked Ramlal to sing. Ramlal sang, "Who is this terrible woman, dark as the sky at midnight? Who is this woman dancing over the field of battle, like a blue lotus that floats on a crimson sea of blood? Who is she, clad alone in the infinite for a garment, rolling her three great eyes in frenzy and savage fury? Under the weight of her tread, the earth itself is trembling. Shiva, her mighty husband, who wields the fearful trident, lies like a lifeless corpse beneath her conquering feet." So a very dramatic song. And you don't often hear songs to Mother Kali in her terrible aspect. But here you do. Of course, the devotees often sing of Mother in her playful aspect or in her loving aspect, even when singing to Kali or the great poets, like Ram Prasad, Kamalakanta. But once in a while, you find this, like Swami Vivekananda's Kali the Mother, his poem, Kali the Mother, which he wrote in a state of ecstasy, and at the end of writing the poem, he collapsed onto the floor unconscious in ecstasy. So, who is this terrible woman? Dark as the sky at midnight. Yes, Kali is black as the sky at midnight. Who is this woman dancing over the field of battle? So, for the field of battle, she's often pictured on the, as it were, on a field of battle. That's taken from the Chandi, where she was out slaying the demons. And you see sometimes in paintings of Mother Kali, you see her, the carnage all around her, severed heads and bodies without their heads and without their limbs and so forth. So like a blue lotus that floats on a crimson sea of blood. So a horrible image, and yet a beautiful image. When you think of it in terms of color. If you think of it in terms of blood, it's horrible. If you think of it in terms of color, it's extraordinary. And if you think of it in terms of Mother Kali and the nature of this world, then also a time comes when we see it as beautiful. Who is she clad alone in the infinite for a garment? She is Digambari, she who is clothed with the four directions, meaning she has no clothes. She's clothed with space alone, with nothing else. Rolling her three great eyes in frenzy and savage fury, obviously the three eyes, under the weight of her tread, the earth itself is trembling. So again, the manifestation of tremendous power, where every step she takes, the whole earth trembles. And Shiva, the absolute, her mighty husband who wields the fearful trident, that is, the trident which destroys all enemies and which destroys ignorance. But even Shiva lies like a lifeless corpse beneath her conquering feet. Shiva has become Shava, Shava meaning a corpse. So the next song described the grief of Mandodari at the death of her husband Ravana. As he listened to it, the master shed tears of sorrow and said, "Once when I entered the pine grove over there, I heard the boatmen on the Ganges singing that song and wept bitterly for a long time. I had to be brought back to my room." So Mandodari, the wife of Ravana, the song of her, expressing her grief over the killing of her husband. And of course, it's addressed to Sri Ram. And so Sri Ramakrishna is reminded of the time that he heard the boatmen singing that song, and that he was so filled with the grief of the bereaved wife, identifying with the mood of Mandodari, that he had to be helped back to his room. So let us stop there for today. That's a good stopping place, yes. And then we'll continue where Ramlal sings about the gopis next time. So let me give announcements, and then if there are any questions that are typed in on YouTube in the comment section, I will take those. So for announcements, on Sunday, we will have the usual Sunday lecture at 11 o'clock, and I will speak on engaging with and disengaging from the world. That is the topic. And next week on Tuesday, we'll have the Gita class at 7:30 and the gospel class on Thursday at 11 o'clock. And we'll continue with our usual schedule. The only exceptions this month are Saturday, November 14th, the 14th of November, which is a Saturday, we will have Kali Puja, our annual Kali Puja. Kali Puja actually falls on the 14th this year, which is a Saturday, which normally means that we would have many people here, which would be nice to have overflowing temple for our Kali Puja. We won't have that because of the pandemic, which unfortunately is getting worse right now as we speak. But we will live stream it as we did with Durga Puja. So if you go to our YouTube channel, you can find it being live streamed. It will start on the 14th, Saturday the 14th, at 6:30 in the evening, and will last basically until 8:30 plus a little bit, perhaps, with the Bhog and the Arati. And then we will have a half an hour window, only half an hour for this because it's already night. For those who want to come and to make pranam to the image, we don't have a statue, we just have a photograph of the Kali in Dakshineshwar, which will be worshipped. But those of you who want to come and see the image of Mother, bow down, offer a flower, you can come for a half an hour period between 8:45 and 9:15. But you must come with wearing a mask, and people will only be allowed in one family unit at a time. So we'll have ushers, so you can come in one family unit at a time, make pranam, offer flower, all of that expeditiously so that people can, everyone has a chance to come in. Everyone who wants has a chance to come in. So, and the other exception is Thanksgiving Day, of course, Thursday, the 26th, I believe it is. We will not have the gospel class that day. So let's see for questions. Noreen, what is the difference between one's samskara and karma? Yes, a good question. Samskara means the two are connected. And so sometimes if you say, well, it's my karma because what I did at some time in the past left a samskara. So a samskara means a particular impression from a particular experience or action. Usually action also is a type of experience. We experience our actions. So a samskara is a impression left on the mind, like a memory, but it doesn't even have to be conscious. As we know that even a person who's on anesthesia and operated on in surgery and they're unconscious, later the pain experienced in the surgery can be recalled in hypnosis, so the memory is there. So an impression is made from every action and every experience we have, and so that is a samskara, and our karma is made out of our samskaras. So karma is that which arises from a samskara. Because I did this thing or these numerous things that were all of a certain pattern of behavior, then my karma comes back to me based on those samskaras. So samskara is the actual memory in the mind or impression in the mind, and the karma is what comes from those impressions, the things that result from those experiences. So then Subhash, do we know what happened to Kedar later? I don't. It may be available. It may be in one of Swami Chaitananandaji's books, which have given us in English a lot more information about the different people who came to Sri Ramakrishna. But I don't remember having seen anything. If I've seen it, I've forgotten it. And so it would be interesting to know. I had the same question, Subhash. And then Dhira, do you look on the current chaos, climate, pandemic, etc., as the mother on a rampage? Good question also. All of them are good questions. Yes, but the rampage of the Divine Mother is not for the purpose of cruelty. We often get that image of Kali, Kali the Terrible, as she's called, that sometimes her rampage seems senseless and cruel and just destructive. But that's because we only see the small picture. We see the pandemic and the terrible suffering many people are going through. That's why I always say when people ask about myself, I say, well, I have to say I'm having no trouble in the pandemic. I'm enjoying the shutdown because it's basically the way I live anyway. And so for me, it's not a problem. But I always add, but I recognize that for many people, it's terrible suffering. And it is terrible suffering for many, even those who are not sick. The economic damage and just the insecurity, instability of society right now is causing tremendous anxiety and fear and other things for people. So I recognize that, and I recognize that that is natural, that that is happening. So when we see just a time slice, which is all that we see, our world of experience right now. We see the pandemic and it looks senseless. We see the political chaos and it looks senseless. We see the climate chaos, which has already begun. Climate change is not a future thing. It's only going to get worse, but it's already happening now. That we see all of these things that just looks like a senseless rampage, senseless carnage. But if we could see the whole picture, then we would see that there is a beauty and a higher logic to the dance of Mother Kali. So yes, I do see it as Mother's rampage, but I realize that I don't understand what it's all about, and I don't need to understand. All I can do is to salute her as the author of everything good and bad, life and death, birth and death. Everything comes from her. But if we go to her, then everything in her makes sense. Outside of her, nothing makes sense. So that's why Sri Ramakrishna said, Mother is and I am, and that's all that I know. I don't know anything else. Mother is and I am. That's all I know. So good questions as always. So I'll give a closing chant. Om Niranjanam Nityam Anantarupam Bhaktanukampa Dhrita Vigraham Vai Ishavataram Parameshamidyam Tam Ramakrishnam Shirasa Namama.